The stagecoach moved like an old prayer whispered across a forgotten plain, slow, faithful, and bound for a place that did not yet know who was coming. Dust curled in its wake, rising like smoke from a memory, and inside sat a woman whose silence had weight. She held her son close, though he had long since fallen asleep, his cheek pressed to her side, his fingers curled into the faded fabric of her skirt. He was 6 years old, and too small for the life he'd already known, but in sleep, he looked peaceful, as if hope still lived somewhere in his dreams. The woman stared out at the horizon, watching how the sky met the earth with no judgment. She did not shift when the wheels jolted over old stone or when the wind tugged at the corners of the letter in her pocket. That letter had brought her here, short, plain, and practical. Cook wanted. Room and board. Steady wages. Widow preferred. She had written back without hope, listing her skills with no mention of the boy. The reply came quick, stamped with a cattle brand she'd never heard of and instructions to take the coach to a ranch a day past the last known town. She had brought one bag and left no one behind. There was nothing to mourn except the fact that she still expected sorrow to follow her, even when there was no one left to give it a name. As the sun sagged behind a distant ridge, she saw it, the ranch, stretching out like a sleeping animal, fenced and wide and utterly alone. A windmill turned lazily in the golden light. Smoke from a chimney curled upward in soft spirals. And by the corral stood a man who didn't wave. The coachman tipped his hat as she stepped down, setting her bag gently beside her. The boy woke with a sleepy blink, rubbing his eyes, then wrapped his arms around her waist. She ran her hand over his hair, dusty brown curls already tangled by the ride, and turned toward the man watching them. He was tall and built like stone, with shoulders that had known work and a face that had forgotten how to smile. The brim of his hat shaded his eyes, but nothing hid the sharpness of his gaze as it moved from her to the boy, then back again. "You didn't say anything about a child," he said quietly, voice like worn leather, "not cruel, just plain." She didn't look away. "I've never had the luxury of being one thing at a time," she said. Silence settled between them like ash. She reached down, lifted her bag, and held the boy's hand. "We'll sleep in the barn if you'd rather. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just need work and a roof that doesn't leak." The man gave no answer, but he turned and walked toward the main house without a word, leaving the door open behind him. She took that as her answer. The bunkhouse was clean, if cold. She tucked the boy into one of the cots and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she unpacked the few things they owned. A pair of cracked boots. A tin box with sewing needles. A faded photo of a woman who might have been her mother. Maybe it was just a face she carried to remember something softer than her own reflection. Night fell without ceremony. Somewhere outside, cattle lowed and a coyote cried out into the dark. She sat on the edge of the cot and watched her son sleep, the rise and fall of his breath steady and sure. Whatever waited tomorrow, he was safe for now. At first light, she was already at the stove. The housekeeper, a narrow woman with stiff hands and eyes like flint, showed her where the coffee was, where the flour was stored, how the men liked their eggs. She spoke little, but her glances said much. Another woman come to be chewed up by silence and hard land. The ranch hands came in one by one, tired, sunburnt men who nodded politely and muttered thanks with full mouths. Her biscuits were hot and her coffee strong. She worked fast and quiet, as if she'd been born to kitchens like this, as if she'd never known saloons or backroom work or folding linens for drunks who stared too long. The boy swept floors and gathered kindling, small and solemn in his duties. No one questioned his presence, though a few looked from him to her with curious eyes. She said nothing. Neither did he. The cattle baron entered last. He removed his hat, hung it neatly by the door, and sat at the end of the long wooden table. His presence was quiet, but not gentle. He did not look at her as she poured his coffee. He simply nodded once, then ate with methodical precision, every movement measured. She studied him only when he wasn't watching. He wore his grief like an invisible cloak, something that had grown so familiar he no longer noticed the weight. There was a ring missing from his left hand, its absence more telling than if he had worn it still. When he finally looked up, it wasn't at her. It was at the boy, who had, for a moment, forgotten he wasn't supposed to smile, caught up in the excitement of stacking firewood in neat rows. The cattle baron watched him, and something flickered, so brief she nearly missed it, before he stood and left without a word. That evening, she found her son asleep on the porch, a blanket folded carefully over him. She hadn't put it there. By the third day, she had earned no praise, but she had also earned no dismissal. That was enough. One afternoon, while slicing onions, she overheard two ranch hands talking near the barn. "Baron's different lately," one said. "Less cold." "Maybe the wind's just shifting," the other replied. She smiled to herself. Not at the words, but at the idea that maybe, just maybe, things could shift without breaking. Late one night, long after the others had gone to sleep, she stepped outside for air. The stars above were endless, like holes poked into the sky by someone lonely. She looked up and thought of all the places she'd been turned away. All the doors that had closed. All the names she'd been called. Here, there was no welcome carved into the wood. But neither had the door been locked. And somehow, that was more than she'd hoped for. Inside, her son stirred in his sleep, whispering dreams only he could hear. She walked back in and pulled the blanket higher on his small shoulders. Then she sat beside him and listened to the quiet of the house, not silence, exactly. More like waiting. And somewhere, deeper in the house, the cattle baron sat at his desk, his hand resting on a letter he hadn't yet answered, another reply to the cook advertisement, this one from a widow in Kansas. He looked at the page for a long time. Then folded it slowly, and threw it into the fire. And outside, the wind moved through the dry grass like a sigh. A story had begun, not with thunder, but with footsteps and warmth, and the soft promise of something unspoken finding shape. The days passed quiet and steady, like river stones smoothed by time. Each morning she rose before the rooster, stoked the stove, and let her hands move through the rhythm of work, chopping, stirring, kneading, until the sun painted long stripes across the kitchen floor. Her boy took to the land with the quiet eagerness of a child who had known too many closed doors. He fetched eggs from the coop, followed the stable boy on morning rounds, and came back with hay tangled in his hair and a shy, satisfied grin. He never asked for much. He'd learned early that asking didn't change anything. She watched him with a kind of aching pride. His father had been a shadow, never cruel, just not there. A man who'd walked into marriage like stepping into a storm cellar and never come out. He'd died young in a mining accident, and she had not wept. Some losses arrive long before death does. The ranch was a world of its own, wind-blown, sun-bitten, endlessly wide. The men worked hard and slept harder. The animals moved through their days with more grace than most people she'd known. And the Baron, well, the Baron did not move at all. He was there, always. Standing near the corral, checking the ledgers, riding out before dawn and returning at dusk. But he did not speak. Not unless it was necessary. His words were measured and few, like they cost something to spend. She did not try to draw him out. He was not cruel. He never raised his voice. But he wore a distance around him like a winter coat, heavy, unyielding, always fastened tight. The housekeeper had told her, in a low moment between peeling potatoes and slicing fatback, that he'd once been different. That his wife had died giving birth to a child who didn't live through the night. That since then, he hadn't laughed, not once. She didn't need the story. She could see it in the way he looked at nothing when others talked. In the way he touched nothing he didn't have to. She thought she understood that kind of grief, not the details, but the weight. She too had buried pieces of herself quietly over the years, with no one to mark the grave. Still, there were signs, if you paid attention. Little things. One morning, her son tripped while carrying a pail of water, spilling it across the front step. The boy stood there, lips pressed together, bracing for the rebuke he expected. The Baron looked down at the wet boards, then at the child, and said nothing. But that evening, a small bundle of fresh rope and a leather pouch of marbles were left outside the bunkhouse door. Another night, when the boy had caught a splinter and whimpered softly, the Baron happened to walk by. He paused, knelt silently, and pulled the splinter with a steady hand. The boy blinked at him like he was seeing something rare, not kindness, but care that asked for nothing in return. He never said the boy's name. But he never forgot it, either. As for her, she stayed in her lane, kept her head down, kept the food hot, the pans clean, and the rooms aired. But her eyes, always, were open. She began to notice that he lingered near the kitchen more often. Not watching, exactly, but near. He listened to the boy hum while drying dishes, to the gentle hush of flour being sifted, to the soft conversations between mother and son that filled the air like a lullaby. Once, she looked up from peeling carrots and found him leaning just inside the doorway, holding a letter in one hand, unread. His eyes met hers for a moment, not in curiosity, but something older. Recognition, perhaps. He did not speak. But he nodded. And then he left. The stable boy, not much older than 12, had taken a liking to her son. They fed the chickens together, chased dogs that didn't need chasing, and once returned covered in mud with a frog in a tin can. She watched them from the porch, a slow warmth curling in her chest. Children still knew how to hope, even when they had no reason to. The housekeeper softened, little by little. She began setting aside extra biscuits for the boy, handing them over with gruff warnings not to spoil his dinner. But her eyes gave her away, kind eyes, tired from years of watching sorrow make a home where joy should have lived. The foreman was a quiet man too, older, silver in his beard and slow in his stride. He never said much, but when he did, it carried weight. One evening, as she was closing the shutters, he said without looking at her, "You're doing good by the boy. This place is different with him around. Feels less hollow." She thanked him, but the word stayed with her. Less hollow, a space didn't need to be full to feel like home. It just needed to stop echoing. The days folded into weeks. The ranch ran like clockwork, and she became part of the rhythm. Her presence was no longer questioned. Her son was no longer an interruption. Still, the Baron remained distant, until the night of the storm. It rolled in from the west, sudden and loud, shaking the windows and rattling loose shingles. Thunder cracked like the sky splitting open, and the boy woke crying, frightened and breathless. She gathered him in her arms, whispering soft things, rocking him on the edge of the cot. But the fear was deep. Storms reminded him of nights when there was no roof, no fire, no one to hold him. She didn't hear the footsteps at first, but she looked up to find the Baron at the doorway of the bunkhouse, soaked from the rain, a bundle of blankets in his arms. He didn't speak. Just stepped in, handed her the blankets, and crouched by the hearth to stoke the embers back to life. The fire caught slowly, growing warm, then bright. The boy's sobs softened. She watched the Baron's face in the flicker, his jaw tight, his hands steady. The boy crawled from her lap and curled near the fire, blankets drawn up to his chin. He fell asleep again within minutes. She looked at the Baron, not with gratitude, but with a kind of understanding, the kind that doesn't need to be named. "You lost a child," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." He stared into the fire. His voice was low, not quite broken. They both went. Within minutes. She smiled at me before she went. Like she knew I couldn't hold any of it. The fire cracked. "I wasn't there for mine," she replied. "Not really. I stayed, yes, but I wasn't there in the ways that mattered. I was just surviving." He nodded. "Sometimes surviving's the bravest thing." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't demand anything. When he stood to leave, she said, "Thank you. For the blankets." He paused at the door, then turned. "He's a good boy. You've done well." He left before she could answer. That night, after the fire died and the storm passed, she lay awake for a long time, listening to the soft breathing of her son. Something in her had loosened, not healed, not yet. But loosened. Like a knot pulled just enough to let breath pass through. By morning, the porch steps had been mended, new wood nailed in clean and even. Her son pointed at them, excited. She said nothing, but her fingers lingered on the smooth grain as they passed. The Baron didn't mention it. But that evening, he ate every bite of her stew, then pushed back his plate and murmured just loud enough for her to hear. Tasted like memory. She smiled, not at him, but at the bowl in her hands. The man who wouldn't speak had begun to say more than words ever could. And she, without planning to, had begun to listen with something deeper than ears. Out beyond the hills, the sun sank low, and the sky turned the color of bruised lavender. Wind swept through the wheat like a lullaby. And in the spaces between silence, something gentle began to take root. Not love, not yet. But the soil had softened. And that was enough. For now. The season turned slow, with the hush of late summer drying into fall, and the first edge of wind scraping its way down from the mountains. The ranch sighed under the changing light, gold seeping into the edges of every morning, shadows falling longer across the ground like time stretching its back. And she, the woman who had arrived without promise or welcome, found herself walking with less hesitation now. Her hands had worn into the rhythm of the place. The men knew her food, the boy knew the land, and the silence between her and the Baron had softened into something almost familiar. But peace, like weather, is never permanent. It shifts. It tests its own weight. The fever came without warning. Her son had gone to bed with flushed cheeks and a cough so slight it sounded like clearing his throat. She'd kissed his forehead and tucked him in tight, telling herself he was only tired, that the dry air had scratched him. But in the small hours, when the moon spilled silver over the cot, his breathing turned shallow, his skin hot to the touch. She sat beside him with a cloth in her hand and dread pressing into her ribs like a cold hand. He twisted in sleep, murmuring nonsense, his lips cracked. She whispered his name and he didn't answer. By dawn, she hadn't slept. She held him, rocked him gently, and sang the old songs, the ones her mother used to hum while washing clothes in creek water and wringing them dry with tired fingers. The housekeeper came at first light, took one look at the boy, and left with urgent steps. When she returned, the Baron was behind her, still pulling on his coat. He said nothing. Just looked at the boy, then at the woman, and then turned to gather wood for the fire. He stoked it higher and hotter than usual. Then disappeared and returned with a bundle of dried herbs and a flask that smelled of peppermint and iron. She met his eyes and understood, he'd seen this before. Together, without words, they fought for the boy's breath. She wiped his brow and fed him spoonfuls of water and mashed apple. The Baron crushed leaves, mixed them with hot water, and passed the mug to her with steady hands. She fed the medicine slowly, drop by drop, as her son whimpered and tried to pull away. No one left the room that day. The boy drifted in and out, burning up, then freezing, his body small and trembling. She never let go of him. And once, just once, when she nearly crumpled with fear, the Baron caught her by the arm and steadied her. "He's strong," he said, voice rough. "He's got you. He'll pull through." It was the first time he'd said anything about her strength. It hit deeper than praise. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The land held its breath, the sky heavy with clouds. Night fell, then another day came. The fever spiked, then broke with the suddenness of a storm receding. The boy sweated through his blanket, then opened his eyes and whispered, "Mama." She wept then, but quietly, folding her face into the crook of his neck. By the third day, he was sitting up, weak but smiling faintly. He asked for biscuits. She made them with trembling hands. When the danger passed, she stepped out onto the porch for air and found the Baron there, staring at the rain falling in soft sheets across the pasture. "It's always the little ones," he said, not looking at her. "That make you believe again." She didn't ask what he meant. She only stood beside him, arms folded, and watched the sky weep like it had held back too long. After that, something changed. Not in grand ways, no confessions, no declarations, but in the quiet way two people begin to share the same language. She found herself lingering when she brought his coffee. He started sitting longer after meals. The boy, once careful around him, began to offer him things, a smooth stone, a drawing, a feather from the coop. The Baron accepted them each with a small nod, as if these were sacred offerings. Once, the boy tripped and scraped his hand. The Baron lifted him gently, carried him inside, cleaned the wound with such precision it made her chest tighten. He didn't speak much, but he never looked away from the child's pain. "I never held mine," he said quietly once the boy had gone to sleep that night. "I didn't even know if I wanted to. And then I lost the choice." She looked at him then, long and steady. "I was never afraid of losing a man. But the thought of losing my child, that's where the fear lives." He nodded, eyes low. "That fear's a door that never shuts, even when the house is warm." Later, she brought him stew for supper. He didn't eat much. But when she moved to leave, he said, "Stay." She sat. For a long time, neither spoke. Then he said, slowly, like testing a limb he hadn't used in years, "You remind me of the prairie." She blinked, surprised. Not soft. Not cruel. Just, too wide to be held all at once. She didn't know what to say. So she said nothing. After that night, he began to walk the fence lines with her. Not every day. Just when the air felt right. They spoke little. But when they did, it was real, not surface, but soul. He told her about the years after the loss. How he'd buried himself in cattle and quiet. How the land spoke when no one else did. She told him about the places she'd worked. About the men who touched without asking and the women who turned their faces away. She told him how being invisible became a kind of safety. He didn't apologize. He didn't pity. He only said, "You were never invisible here." Her breath caught at that. Then the letter arrived. It came folded in a gray envelope, sealed in government ink. A name she hadn't heard in years, a cousin of her late husband, claiming blood and rights and responsibility. The letter was formal, but the message was clear: the boy had property in his father's name. A man she'd never met wanted him. She read it twice, then folded it and set it aside. When she went to find the Baron, he was already walking toward her. He'd read the same letter. His jaw was tight. His eyes were darker than usual. "He wants the boy?" She nodded. "He wants what the boy might own someday. He'll come here?" She shrugged. "They always do." He said nothing, but the next day, he had papers drawn up. A contract for her employment. A statement declaring her permanent residence. Proof that the boy had a stable home. He handed her the folder with quiet hands. "I can stand in court beside you," he said. She touched the pages but didn't open them. "And what would you say?" "That I posted for a cook," he replied. "But you came." Her eyes burned. "You didn't ask for this," she said. "I didn't ask for silence either," he replied. "But I lived with it. You brought something else." Later that night, when the rain returned, she stood by the boy's bedside and watched his steady breath. Then she walked out to the barn, where the Baron stood in the open doorway, hat soaked, coat hanging loose. She joined him, shoulder to shoulder. The rain beat soft against the roof. "I'm not a woman most men would choose," she said, "not as sorrow, just as fact." He looked at her, his face unreadable. "I'm not most men," he said. And they stood there, two people who had survived everything but love, watching the rain write its story into the dust. In the distance, thunder rolled, not loud, but promising. And between them, something took root. Not fast. Not fiery. But real. And ready. Even if the storm was still to come. The man arrived under a bright sun with polished boots and a mouth full of honeyed threats. His coat was too clean for a place like this, and his words too smooth to trust. He carried himself like someone used to closing doors with a smile, and he looked at her boy like a ledger waiting to be claimed. A cousin, he said. Blood kin. Legal heir through the boy's dead father's line. He offered a handshake the boy refused to take. She stood between them, hands folded tight, voice calm but rooted deep. You've never written. Never asked. Never sent coin or comfort. And now you want him? I want what's right, he said, tilting his head like a man who thought charm could cover rot. The child has land through his father. Half of it should be mine by name. But I'm willing to take the whole burden if the courts agree. The Baron stood behind her, quiet as always, but this time the silence felt heavier, awaiting thunder. We won't let him go, he said simply. The cousin scoffed. You? You're not his kin. What are you to him? She answered before the Baron could. I'm the one who stayed when his father didn't. I'm the one who fed him when no one cared if he ate. I'm the arms he runs to when the wind howls too hard and the one who knows which night he dreams of rivers and which night he dreams of wolves. The man frowned. Sentiment doesn't win courtrooms. No, she said, her voice rising just a little. But truth might. 2 days later, a court official arrived, dusty and drawn, with a clipboard in hand and little patience for feelings. He asked questions. Took notes. Measured facts against faces. The cousin had letters, old documents, and a witness who'd barely known the boy's father. The ranch had stories. The boy had smiles and scars. And the Baron had something stronger than all of them. He had steadiness. That morning, he stepped forward not in rage, but with a folded document and clear eyes. This is a contract, he said. This woman is employed here, housed here, protected here. This boy has a bed, an education, 3 meals a day, and the care of everyone under this roof. He is safer here than anywhere that man could take him. And you? The official asked, squinting at him. What is your connection to the child? The Baron looked to her then, not just at her, but into her. Something passed between them like a current warming cold hands. He turned back to the official. I am the one who posted for a cook and got a family instead. I didn't ask for it. But I'll stand for it. Every damn day if I have to. The official blinked. Paused. Then scribbled a note. The cousin's face twisted like spoiled fruit. He tried to speak, but the air had changed. What once had been a technical matter was now a story with a heart too loud to ignore. She saw the shift, not just in the official's eyes, but in the boy's. He stepped closer to the Baron, stood beside him, and said in a clear, small voice, "He's mine." That night, the papers were signed. The man rode off alone, his coat no longer clean. The court official left without much ceremony. Just a nod and a final stamp. No one cheered. No one needed to. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, she stood on the porch watching the boy play with the stable dog, his laughter bright as spilled milk. She felt something inside her settle. Not end, just settle, like dust after a storm. She turned to go in, but the Baron was already there, holding the door open. He didn't speak. Just looked at her the way a man does when he stopped asking permission and started asking truth. She stepped inside. The warmth followed. Later, by the fire, he sat across from her, turning a small wooden carving over in his hand, a horse, just like the one he'd left for the boy weeks ago. His fingers moved over it as though smoothing grief. You never needed saving, he said finally. No, she replied. Just someone who wouldn't leave when it got hard. I don't plan to leave, he said, voice low. She looked at him, really looked, and felt the old ache loosen again, the fear that had lived behind her ribs for years finally dissolving like sugar in warm tea. Neither do I, she whispered. The boy came in, sleepy-eyed, dragging a blanket. He crawled into her lap, head against her chest. She wrapped her arms around him and met the Baron's gaze across the room. You ever think, she said softly, that maybe the thunder we fear is the rain we needed all along? He nodded once. And outside, far off on the horizon, the sky lit up, not in violence, but in beauty. Lightning without sound. Just enough to remind them the sky was alive and watching. They sat that way until the fire dipped low. And when she rose to carry the boy to bed, the Baron rose too, not to stop her, not to help, just to walk beside her. A man who wouldn't speak. And a woman who had been silenced too long. They didn't need vows. They had moments. They had hands reaching across quiet. They had thunder, not to fear, but to choose. And they did. Quietly. Fully. Forever.